The battlefield, where hope was dying. Far from Earth, in a cold and silent part of the galaxy, a great battle was coming to an end. The stars around the planet Zareth Prime were filled with broken ships, drifting metal, and fading lights from destroyed fleets. Explosions had already burned through the darkness for hours. What once looked like a powerful army now looked like the ruins of a lost war. At the center of the battlefield floated a large alien warship. It was the flagship of the Zareth Empire. The ship was damaged. One side of its armor was cracked. Several weapons were silent forever. Emergency lights flashed across the long command bridge. Inside the bridge stood Queen Lyara, the last ruler of her people. She was tall, calm, and proud, even while the war around her collapsed. Her silver armor showed scratches from earlier battles. Her long white cloak moved softly in the low gravity of the ship. Around her, the alien commanders stared at the battle screens with growing fear. One officer spoke in a quiet voice. "Your Majesty, enemy fleets have surrounded us." The main screen showed the truth. Hundreds of warships from the Fourth Dominion were closing in from every direction. Their ships were dark, sharp, and built for war. Their weapons were already charging. There was no escape path. Another officer stepped forward. "Our remaining fleet is down to 12 ships, and their fleet is more than 200. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The war was over. For years, the Zareth Empire had fought the Fourth Dominion across dozens of star systems. Entire worlds had burned. Cities had fallen. Millions had died. Now only one fleet remained, and it was trapped. The Queen looked at the screen quietly. Her voice was calm. "So, this is where our story ends?" No one answered. A young officer finally spoke. "We still have a small escape shuttle prepared for you, Your Majesty. If you leave now, we may be able to slip through the outer fleet." The Queen slowly shook her head. "And leave my people behind to die alone?" The officer lowered his head. "But if the Dominion captures you, the Empire will truly fall." The Queen looked around the bridge. Every soldier here had chosen to stay. Every officer knew the danger, and yet none of them had left. She gave a small, proud smile. "The Empire is not a crown or a throne," she said softly. "It is our people and our courage." Outside the ship, the enemy fleet moved closer. Weapons glowed like red stars in the darkness. The Dominion commander opened a communication channel. A harsh voice filled the bridge. "Queen Lyara of Zareth, surrender your ship. Your death will end this war quickly." Several officers clenched their fists. The Queen did not even react. Instead, she calmly sat in the command chair. "For if they wish for my death," she said quietly, "they will have to earn it." The enemy fleet began to prepare its attack. Hundreds of targeting signals locked onto the Queen's ship. One officer whispered in fear, "Your Majesty, they are preparing full fleet fire. If they fired together, the flagship would be destroyed in seconds." Everyone on the bridge understood the truth. This was the final moment. Then suddenly, a strange signal appeared on the radar. One of the technicians leaned closer to the screen. "Wait, that cannot be right." Another officer looked over. "What is it?" The technician spoke slowly. "There is a ship approaching the battlefield." The Queen turned slightly. "From which direction?" The officer zoomed the scanner view. "Outer sector, entering fast." The ship was very small compared to the giant warships around them. Just a single fighter craft, one pilot. The bridge filled with confusion. "That cannot be one of ours," another officer said. "Our fleet registry shows nothing there." The technician checked the data again. Then his eyes widened. It's human." Several officers looked surprised. "Human!" Humans were still new to the galaxy. Their fleets were small, their technology was unusual, but everyone knew one thing about humans. They were unpredictable. The tiny fighter flew straight into the battlefield, not slowing, not turning, while flying directly toward the enemy fleet. The Queen watched the screen with quiet interest. The fighter opened a communication channel. For a moment, the bridge speakers were silent. Then a calm, male voice spoke. "This is Captain Daniel Hayes of the Terran Defense Fleet." The alien officers looked at each other. The voice continued. "I'm reading a very unfair fight out here." Enemy ships began to turn toward the fighter. The human pilot spoke again, almost casually. Queen Lyara, I suggest you hold your position." The Queen raised an eyebrow slightly. "And why would we do that, Captain Hayes?" There was a short pause. Then the human answered. "Because someone has to stand between you and that fleet." Outside the flagship window, the tiny fighter accelerated, straight toward the massive enemy armada, hundreds of warships, against one human pilot. The Dominion fleet commander laughed across the open channel. "One human fighter?" he said mockingly. "You think this changes anything?" Inside the small cockpit of the fighter, Captain Hayes tightened his grip on the controls. His voice was calm. "Yeah." The fighter engines burned brighter. The human ship shot forward into the center of the enemy fleet, and the battle truly began. The warrior from Earth. The small human fighter cut through the darkness of space like a bright spark flying into a storm. Around it floated hundreds of massive Dominion warships, each one large enough to destroy an entire city. Their cannons were already glowing with power, ready to fire. Compared to them, the human ship looked like nothing more than a tiny piece of metal drifting toward certain death. Inside the flagship of the Zareth Empire, every officer on the bridge watched the screens with deep confusion. None of them could understand why a single human pilot would fly directly into a battle that even a full fleet could not win. Yet the fighter kept moving forward without hesitation, its engines burning brighter as it closed the distance with the enemy fleet. Queen Lyara stood quietly beside the command console and studied the incoming data. The ship identification confirmed what the technicians had already said. The fighter truly belonged to the Terran Defense Fleet. Humans had joined the galactic stage only a few decades earlier. Compared to ancient empires like Zareth and the ruthless Dominion, the humanity was still young and unknown. Their fleets were small, their territories limited, and their history among the stars very short. But in those few decades, one thing had already become clear across the galaxy. Humans fought differently from other species. They were emotional where others were calm, reckless where others were careful, and when pushed into a corner, they had a strange habit of doing the impossible. One of the alien commanders finally broke the silence on the bridge. Then he looked at the screen with disbelief as the tiny fighter continued to fly directly toward the Dominion formation. The officer spoke slowly, almost as if he could not believe the words coming out of his mouth. "Your Majesty, the human pilot is not turning away. He is flying straight into their front line." Another officer checked the tactical display again, hoping the sensors were wrong, but the readings stayed the same. The human fighter had increased speed instead of slowing down. Queen Lyara folded her hands behind her back and watched the screen with calm curiosity. Her voice remained steady as she spoke. "Open a direct communication channel with the human ship." A moment later, the connection opened. The bridge speakers carried the quiet hum of the fighter's engines before the human pilot answered. "This is Captain Daniel Hayes. Channel open." The Queen stepped forward and spoke clearly so the human pilot could hear her. "Captain Hayes, this battlefield is lost. You are flying alone into a fleet that outnumbers you 200 to 1. Why are you here?" For a few seconds, the channel stayed silent. The officers on the bridge exchanged uncertain looks, wondering if the human would even answer. Then the calm voice returned. "Because someone had to show up." The answer confused several officers, but Queen Lyara did not react. Instead, she asked another question. "Your fleet is not present in this sector. You were not ordered to assist us. Right, so why risk your life in a battle that does not belong to you?" On the other side of the channel, Captain Hayes gave a small laugh that carried through the speakers. It was not the laugh of someone afraid. It sounded more like the laugh of a man who had already made up his mind. "Back on Earth, we have a saying," he replied. "If you see someone about to be crushed and you're the only one close enough to help, you don't ask permission first." Before anyone could answer, so the Dominion fleet reacted. Their scanners had finally locked onto the human fighter, and several of their interceptor ships moved forward to eliminate the small threat before it could get any closer. 20 sleek attack ships launched from the Dominion formation and rushed toward the human craft in perfect formation. Their engines burned red as they accelerated to intercept. On the Zareth flagship, one of the tactical officers quickly ran the numbers and felt his stomach tighten. "The Dominion has deployed interceptors," he reported. 20 ships approaching the human fighter at high speed." Queen Lyara watched the screen carefully as the distance between the interceptors and the human ship disappeared. The outcome seemed obvious. 20 trained pilots flying advanced Dominion warcraft against one small Terran fighter should not even be considered a fight. The alien officers prepared themselves to watch the human ship vanish from the battlefield within seconds. But the moment the interceptors opened fire, something unexpected happened. The human fighter moved. Instead of flying in a straight line, the craft twisted sharply to the side, sliding between streams of enemy fire with impossible precision. The movement was so fast that several officers on the bridge leaned forward in shock. The fighter flipped upside down, dove beneath one of the interceptors, and fired a burst of bright blue plasma. The Dominion ship exploded instantly. Before the other pilots could react, the Terran fighter rolled upward and shot past 2 more ships, firing again. Another explosion lit up the darkness. The bridge of the Zareth flagship fell silent as the battle unfolded on the screens. The human fighter was not running away. It was attacking. Captain Hayes moved through the enemy formation with fearless speed, weaving between the Dominion ships like a blade cutting through cloth. Every few seconds, another interceptor exploded. The Dominion pilots began to scatter, breaking their formation as they tried to track the unpredictable movements of the Terran craft. The human pilot did not slow down or hesitate. He attacked again and again, striking from angles the enemy ships could not defend against. One of the alien commanders whispered in disbelief while staring at the tactical display. "This human fights like someone who expects to die." Another officer slowly shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "He fights like someone who has already accepted it." Within minutes, the impossible had happened. The 20 Dominion interceptors that had rushed to destroy the human fighter were now nothing but drifting debris. The tiny Terran ship floated in the middle of the wreckage, its engines glowing calmly, as if the battle had been nothing more than a routine patrol. The Dominion fleet, which had been preparing to execute the Queen's flagship, now turned their attention toward the unexpected threat. Inside the cockpit of the Terran fighter, Captain Daniel Hayes looked out at the massive enemy armada filling the stars ahead of him. Hundreds of warships were slowly adjusting their positions, preparing to erase the small human craft from existence. Hayes tightened his grip on the controls and let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered quietly to himself, "that got their attention." Far behind him, Queen Lyara watched the battlefield and felt something she had not felt in many hours. Hope. But the real battle was only beginning. The Queen's impossible decision. The destruction of the Dominion interceptors sent a wave of shock across the battlefield. On the Zareth flagship, officers stared at the main tactical screen as if they were watching something impossible unfold. Just minutes earlier, they had accepted that their final moments were approaching. The Dominion fleet had surrounded them, their weapons ready to fire, their victory certain. Now the battlefield looked different. The wreckage of 20 enemy ships floated in space, destroyed by a single human fighter that continued to move calmly between the massive warships ahead. It was a small victory, but it had broken the silence of defeat that had filled the command bridge. Queen Lyara remained standing beside the command console, her eyes fixed on the human ship's position. The Terran fighter looked so small compared to the giant Dominion battleships that surrounded it. Yet the data scrolling across the tactical display told a different story. The human pilot had destroyed 20 interceptors in less than 3 minutes. The precision of his movements and the speed of his attacks were unlike anything the Zareth commanders had seen before. Even the most skilled pilots of the Empire would have struggled to survive against that many enemy ships, let alone destroy them all. One of the senior officers stepped closer to the Queen and spoke with quiet concern. "Your Majesty, the Dominion fleet is reorganizing. Their battleships are targeting the human fighter now." The officer paused before continuing. "They will not underestimate him again." The Queen nodded slowly as she watched the enemy ships shift their formation. Dozens of Dominion warships were already turning their weapon arrays toward the small Terran craft. The human pilot had succeeded in drawing their attention away from the Zareth flagship, but that meant something else as well. The Dominion fleet would not allow such an insult to stand. They would destroy the human fighter with overwhelming force. Queen Lyara gave a quiet order. "Open a private communication channel with Captain Hayes." The signal reached the human fighter within seconds. The calm voice of the Terran pilot returned through the bridge speakers. "Captain Hayes here." The Queen spoke directly. "Human pilot, you have already done more than anyone expected. But the Dominion fleet is now fully focused on your ship. If you continue this attack, you will not survive." For a moment, the channel stayed silent. The alien officers waited, expecting the human pilot to acknowledge the warning and retreat while he still had the chance. Instead, the voice that answered sounded almost amused. "That's kind of the point." Several officers looked at each other in confusion. The Queen narrowed her eyes slightly. "Explain." Hayes replied without hesitation. "Your fleet was about to be wiped out. Their entire armada was aiming at you. But now they're looking at me instead." There was a short pause before he added, "Which means you've got time." The Queen glanced at the tactical display again. The human was right. The Dominion ships had shifted their targeting patterns. Most of their weapons were now locked onto the Terran fighter rather than the Zareth fleet. Still, the Queen spoke carefully. You cannot defeat them alone." Another quiet laugh came from the human pilot. "Your Majesty, I'm not trying to defeat them." The bridge grew silent as everyone listened. Hayes continued calmly. "I'm just trying to keep them busy." The realization spread slowly through the command center. The human fighter had never intended to win this battle. Its purpose was distraction. By forcing the Dominion fleet to focus on him, the Terran pilot was buying precious time for the trapped Zareth fleet. One of the officers spoke urgently to the Queen. "If we move now, we might be able to break through the outer formation while the Dominion ships are distracted." The Queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she continued speaking to the human pilot. "Captain Hayes, you are risking your life for a fleet that is not your own, for a war that does not belong to your people. Why?" The answer came quickly. "Because if the Dominion wins here, they won't stop with your empire." The Queen listened quietly. Hayes continued in the same calm tone. "Back on Earth, we learned something the hard way. If you wait until the enemy reaches your doorstep, it's already too late." Outside the flagship, the Dominion fleet began firing. Streams of energy weapons tore through the darkness toward the Terran fighter. The human craft twisted sharply and accelerated between the blasts, dodging the first wave of attacks with incredible speed. Even the alien officers watching from the bridge could barely follow the fighter's movements on the screen. The Queen spoke again, her voice softer now. "Captain Hayes, Your actions will be remembered. The human pilot answered simply, That's not why I'm here. The fighter suddenly surged forward again, flying directly toward the center of the Dominion formation. Hundreds of enemy weapons began tracking the small ship as it raced toward them. And the Queen looked at the tactical map and finally made her decision. All ships, she commanded, her voice strong once more, prepare to break through the western flank. The Zareth fleet engines began to power up. For the first time in hours, they had a chance to escape. And far ahead of them, alone in the darkness of space, one human fighter was holding back an entire empire. One human against an empire. The battlefield that had once been filled with quiet fear was now burning with chaos. The moment Captain Hayes pushed his fighter deeper into the Dominion formation, the entire enemy fleet reacted like a disturbed storm. Massive warships began to rotate slowly, their long cannons glowing brighter as they prepared to fire. Dozens of targeting systems locked onto the small Terran craft, calculating angles, speeds, and firing patterns designed to eliminate the human ship in seconds. To the Dominion commanders, the situation seemed simple. No pilot, no matter how skilled, that could survive against the combined firepower of hundreds of warships. The destruction of the interceptors had been embarrassing, but now the human would face the full weight of the Dominion fleet. Inside the cockpit of his fighter, Captain Daniel Hayes watched the tactical display carefully as red warning signals began to flood across the screen. His ship's sensors detected more than 100 weapons locking onto his position. The computer voice calmly listed the threats one after another, a warning that survival chances were dropping rapidly. Hayes listened to the alerts without panic. He had already expected this moment. When he had turned his ship toward the Dominion fleet earlier, he knew exactly how the battle would unfold. The human pilot adjusted his grip on the control stick and pushed the engines harder, sending the fighter accelerating straight toward the enemy warships rather than away from them. On the Zareth flagship, the alien officers watched the tactical display with growing disbelief as the human fighter performed maneuvers that looked almost impossible. Instead of fleeing from the Dominion fleet, Hayes moved directly through it, weaving between massive warships and slipping through the gaps in their firing lines. Enemy cannons blasted streams of burning energy across the darkness, but the Terran fighter twisted and rolled between them with astonishing precision. The small craft moved so quickly that several Dominion ships nearly fired upon each other while trying to track it. Every time the fighter passed near an enemy vessel, its weapons flashed briefly, and another Dominion ship erupted into flames. Queen Lyara stood silently beside the command console while watching the battle unfold across the screen. She had spent her entire life studying warfare, strategy, and leadership. She had commanded fleets, negotiated peace treaties, and fought enemies across half the galaxy. Yet even she struggled to understand what she was seeing now. The human pilot was not simply fighting bravely. He was fighting like someone who understood the battlefield better than everyone else on it. Each movement of his fighter forced the Dominion ships to reposition, turning their powerful cannons away from the escaping Zareth fleet and toward the unpredictable Terran craft. With every second that passed, and the human pilot continued to pull the enemy's attention away from the Queen's fleet. Behind him, the remaining ships of the Zareth Empire began their escape attempt. Their engines burned bright as they accelerated toward the weak point in the Dominion formation that Hayes had unknowingly created. Several Dominion warships noticed the movement and tried to turn their weapons toward the fleeing fleet, but each time they attempted to change position, the Terran fighter attacked again. And the small ship darted through their formation like a sharp blade, striking quickly before disappearing into the darkness again. The Dominion commanders soon realized that ignoring the human pilot was impossible. Every moment he remained active, more of their ships were being damaged or destroyed. The Dominion fleet commander, watching from the bridge of his enormous flagship, felt his patience slowly turn into anger. The human fighter had disrupted what should have been a perfect victory. The Zareth fleet had been seconds away from destruction, yet now the Dominion formation had been forced to scatter to deal with a single pilot. The commander slammed his clawed hand against the console and barked orders to his officers. "Deploy the drone swarm. Flood the area with tracking units. I want that human ship destroyed immediately." Hundreds of small, automated drones launched from the Dominion warships and rushed toward the Terran fighter like a cloud of metal insects. Captain Hayes saw the swarm approaching on his sensors and muttered quietly under his breath. The drones were fast, small, and extremely difficult to evade. They were designed to surround a target and fire simultaneously from every direction. For most pilots, encountering a drone swarm meant certain destruction. But Hayes had faced similar weapons before during earlier battles. Instead of running from the swarm, he accelerated toward it. And the fighter shot directly into the center of the approaching drones, spinning and firing in rapid bursts as explosions flashed around him. Several drones collided with each other while trying to track the fighter's unpredictable movements. Others detonated under the fire of the Terran ship's plasma cannons. On the Zareth flagship, the bridge crew watched the fight in stunned silence as the human pilot carved a path through the swarm. The drones had been deployed to trap him. Yet somehow he had turned their own numbers against them. Explosions lit up the battlefield as dozens of drones were destroyed in seconds. The surviving machines struggled to keep up with the fighter's movements as it twisted and rolled through the chaos. One of the alien officers finally spoke in a quiet voice filled with disbelief. He turned toward the Queen and said softly, "Your Majesty, this human fights as if fear does not exist." Queen Lyara continued watching the battle without moving. After a long moment, she answered calmly, "No. He feels fear just like any warrior. The difference is that he does not allow it to stop him." Her eyes remained fixed on the tactical display as the Terran fighter continued to move through the Dominion formation. The human ship was now deep inside the enemy fleet, surrounded by warships many times its size. Yet instead of retreating, the fighter accelerated again, striking at another Dominion cruiser before disappearing between two battleships that were too large to maneuver quickly enough to follow. Far behind him, the Zareth fleet finally reached the weak point in the Dominion formation. Several of their ships slipped through the gap and accelerated toward open space. The escape was not perfect, and a few Dominion ships began chasing them, but the majority of the enemy fleet remained focused on the human pilot who had disrupted their formation. For the first time since the battle had begun, Queen Lyara saw the possibility that her fleet might actually survive. But the Queen also knew something else. The longer Captain Hayes remained inside the Dominion formation, the more dangerous the situation would become for him. The enemy fleet was adapting quickly. New ships were moving into position and heavier weapons were being prepared. And the human fighter had already accomplished something extraordinary by holding their attention for this long. Yet the battle was far from over, and the Dominion fleet was preparing to strike back with everything they had. The battlefield had changed, but the danger had not disappeared. While the Zareth fleet pushed toward open space through the narrow gap in the Dominion formation, and the majority of the enemy armada remained focused on one target, the lone Terran fighter still moving through their ranks. The Dominion commanders had now realized the truth. The human pilot was not trying to destroy their fleet entirely. His goal had been distraction from the very beginning. By forcing their ships to chase him, he had created the opening the Zareth fleet needed to escape. It was a simple strategy, but it had worked better than anyone could have imagined. See, inside the cockpit of his fighter, Captain Daniel Hayes could see the shifting pattern of enemy ships on his tactical display. The Dominion fleet had begun tightening their formation again, closing the gaps that had allowed him to move freely earlier in the battle. Their commanders were learning from the chaos he had created. Large cruisers were now positioning themselves in layers, forming a moving wall of weapons designed to trap the small Terran craft in overlapping fields of fire. And Hayes knew exactly what that meant. The Dominion fleet had stopped underestimating him. A warning signal flashed across the cockpit console as a blast from a Dominion cruiser passed dangerously close to the fighter's wing. The shockwave rattled the small ship and sent several alarms echoing through the cockpit. Hayes adjusted the controls quickly, forcing the fighter into a sharp roll before accelerating between two enemy battleships that were still turning to face him. His breathing remained calm, but the battle was beginning to show its toll. The fighter's shield systems had already taken multiple hits. One of the maneuvering thrusters was operating at reduced power. The longer he stayed inside the Dominion fleet, the harder it would become to keep avoiding their attacks. Far behind him, the Zareth fleet was finally beginning to break free of the Dominion trap. Several of their ships had already cleared the outer edge of the enemy formation and were accelerating into deep space. The Queen's flagship remained near the rear of the escaping fleet, protecting the slower vessels that had been damaged earlier in the battle. From the bridge of the flagship, Queen Lyara watched the tactical display with a mixture of relief and concern. The escape was working, but one small symbol on the screen remained surrounded by hundreds of enemy ships, and the Terran fighter. One of the Zareth officers spoke quietly as he monitored the human pilot's position. "Your Majesty, the Dominion fleet has completely shifted their focus toward Captain Hayes. They are no longer targeting our ships." The Queen nodded slowly. She already knew what that meant. The human pilot had successfully drawn the attention of an entire armada. Without his intervention, the Zareth fleet would have been destroyed within minutes. Instead, they were now escaping while the Dominion fleet chased a single fighter. But the Queen could also see the other truth on the tactical screen. The human pilot was running out of space. Back in the fighter's cockpit, Hayes noticed the same thing. The Dominion fleet had begun surrounding his position from multiple directions. Their ships were forming a wide circle, gradually tightening it as they moved inward. Massive cruisers drifted slowly closer while smaller attack ships filled the gaps between them. The strategy was simple but effective. The Dominion fleet intended to trap the Terran fighter inside a shrinking cage of warships until there was no room left for escape. Hayes leaned back slightly in his seat and studied the display. He had known this moment would come eventually. No matter how skilled he was, a single fighter could not fight an entire armada forever. His ship had already pushed beyond its normal limits during the battle. The engines were overheating, the shield generators were barely holding, and the weapon systems were nearly drained of power. Still, the human pilot allowed himself a small smile, because the plan had worked. He opened a private communication channel and transmitted a signal to the Zareth flagship. A moment later, Queen Lyara's voice answered through the cockpit speakers. "Captain Hayes." The human pilot kept his eyes on the approaching Dominion ships while he spoke. "Your fleet is clear of the formation. You should be able to jump to hyperspace soon." There was a short silence before the Queen responded. "That is correct, but you are still surrounded." Hayes glanced at the tactical display again. Hundreds of Dominion warships were slowly closing in on his position, their weapons glowing brighter as they prepared for the final strike. The human pilot nodded to himself, even though the Queen could not see him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Looks that way." The Queen's voice carried a rare note of seriousness. "Captain Hayes, you have already saved my fleet. Your duty is complete. Withdraw now and we will attempt to cover your retreat." For a few seconds, the human pilot did not answer. Instead, he studied the pattern of the Dominion ships moving around him. Their formation was nearly complete now. They understood that escaping this trap would be almost impossible. But escaping had never been the goal. When he finally spoke again, his voice remained calm and steady. "Your Majesty, if I leave now, they'll turn their fleet around and chase you. You've still got damaged ships that won't outrun them." The Queen understood the meaning of his words immediately. If the human fighter disappeared, the Dominion fleet would simply refocus on the Zareth ships that were still within range. The escape that Hayes had created would collapse instantly. The Queen spoke firmly. "You cannot fight them alone forever." Hayes looked out through the cockpit window at the massive Dominion battleships drifting closer in every direction. Their dark hulls filled the stars, blocking out the distant light of space. For the first time since the battle had begun, the Terran fighter had stopped moving. The enemy fleet believed they had finally trapped their target. The human pilot reached toward the control panel beside his seat and activated a hidden switch. Deep inside the fighter's engine core, a warning system began counting down as the reactor power levels started climbing rapidly. "Maybe not forever," Hayes said quietly, "but long enough." Across the battlefield, the Dominion fleet prepared to fire, and in the center of their formation, one small human fighter was about to make its final move. The human who would not fall. For several long seconds, the battlefield seemed to freeze. The Dominion fleet had completed its trap. Massive warships formed a tightening ring around the lone Terran fighter, their weapon systems glowing brighter as they charged for the final strike. To the Dominion commanders, victory now looked inevitable again. The human pilot who had disrupted their perfect battle had finally run out of space to run, and then the small fighter now floated quietly in the center of their formation like prey surrounded by hunters. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Hayes watched the tactical display with calm focus. Warning signals flashed across nearly every console. His shields were almost gone. Several systems had taken damage during the earlier fighting, and the fighter's engines were overheating after pushing beyond their normal limits for so long. And any other pilot might have panicked while surrounded by such overwhelming power. But Hayes had already accepted the risk when he flew into the Dominion formation earlier. This moment was always part of the plan. Across the battlefield, the Zareth fleet had nearly escaped the Dominion blockade. Their ships were accelerating away from the battle zone, engines burning bright as they prepared to jump into hyperspace. Yet on the bridge of the Queen's flagship, no one celebrated the escape, and every officer watched the tactical screen in silence, their attention fixed on the single Terran fighter still trapped deep inside the enemy fleet. Queen Lyara stood beside the main display, her expression calm but thoughtful. The human pilot had accomplished something no one had believed possible. By attacking the Dominion formation alone, he had forced an entire armada to focus on him instead of the trapped Zareth fleet. His actions had given them the opportunity to escape when defeat had seemed certain. Yet the Queen knew that the same bravery that had saved them was now placing the human pilot in even greater danger. One of the officers stepped closer to the Queen, studying the screen carefully. "Your Majesty, Captain Hayes's fighter has stopped moving," he reported quietly. "The Dominion ships have completely surrounded him." Another officer spoke with concern. "Their weapons are charging. They will fire within moments." The Queen remained silent as she watched the display. The human fighter symbol sat motionless in the center of the Dominion fleet while hundreds of enemy ships prepared to destroy it. For the first time since the battle had begun, the Terran craft had not attempted to dodge or attack. It simply floated there, surrounded by enemies. Then a new signal appeared on the tactical screen. A sudden spike of energy began rising from the human fighter. Back inside the cockpit, Hayes glanced at the glowing reactor monitor beside him. The numbers were climbing rapidly now as the fighter's core power system began pushing far beyond its safe limits. The overload process had already begun. Once it reached a certain point, there would be no way to stop it. He allowed himself a slow breath as he looked out through the cockpit window at the enormous Dominion ships surrounding him. Some of the enemy warships were so large that they filled half the view outside his canopy. Their weapon arrays were aimed directly at his small fighter, waiting for the final order to fire. Hayes leaned slightly forward in his seat and opened one last communication channel. "Queen Lyara." The signal reached the Zareth flagship almost instantly. The Queen stepped toward the communication console and answered him. Captain Hayes, we are receiving a power surge from your ship. What are you doing? The human pilot smiled faintly as he checked the rising reactor levels again. Buying you a little more time. On the bridge of the flagship, the officers began exchanging worried looks as the tactical screen updated with new data. The energy output from the Terran fighter was climbing at an impossible rate. One of the Zareth technicians finally understood what the human pilot was doing. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. Your Majesty, the human fighter is overloading its core. The bridge fell silent. If the reactor inside the small fighter detonated at maximum output, the explosion would release enough energy to damage or destroy every ship within several kilometers. Deep inside the Dominion formation, that kind of blast could tear apart dozens of warships at once. Queen Lyara's eyes widened slightly as she understood the meaning of the rising power readings. Captain Hayes, she said firmly through the communication channel, stop the overload immediately. Your ship will not survive it. The human pilot listened quietly before answering. I know. Outside his cockpit window, the Dominion fleet had also noticed the growing energy signature coming from the Terran fighter. Several enemy warships began adjusting their positions, clearly confused by the strange readings coming from the small human craft. The commander leaned forward over his console. Commander leaned forward over his console as the reports came in. What is the human ship doing? He demanded angrily. One of his officers answered nervously. Unknown, Commander, but its energy output is increasing far beyond normal fighter limits. The commander narrowed his eyes. Destroy it immediately. Across the battlefield, dozens of Dominion warships began firing at once. Streams of burning energy blasted toward the Terran fighter from every direction. In the cockpit, warning alarms screamed as Hayes pulled the controls one final time. The small fighter suddenly accelerated forward, slipping between two massive Dominion cruisers before they could adjust their aim. The enemy weapons slammed into the ships behind him instead, causing explosions that lit up the darkness. Hayes pushed the damaged engines as hard as they would go, guiding the fighter deeper into the center of the Dominion formation, where the enemy ships were packed closest together. The reactor warning lights turned red. The overload had reached the final stage. Back on the Zareth flagship, the tactical display suddenly flared bright as the human fighter's power signature spiked beyond measurable levels. The bridge officers stared at the screen in shock as the readings climbed higher and higher. Queen Lyara whispered quietly to herself as she watched the small symbol on the screen. This human... Before she could finish the thought, the sensors detected something new. A small object had just launched from the Terran fighter. An escape pod. Inside the overloaded fighter, Hayes pressed the emergency ejection control and felt the violent force of the launch system throwing him away from the doomed ship. The small escape pod shot into space just as the Terran fighter continued flying forward under its final automated command. The Dominion fleet had only seconds to react. Then the fighter's reactor reached critical overload. A blinding explosion erupted in the center of the Dominion formation, releasing a massive shockwave that tore through the surrounding warships. Several cruisers were instantly ripped apart as the blast expanded outward. Smaller Dominion ships were thrown violently off course as debris and burning metal filled the battlefield. From the bridge of the Zareth flagship, the officers watched the massive explosion bloom across the tactical screen like a new star being born. The Dominion formation shattered instantly. Dozens of their ships were destroyed or disabled by the blast. For the second time in the battle, one human pilot had completely changed the fate of an entire fleet. But as the explosion faded and the battlefield filled with drifting wreckage, the Zareth sensors searched desperately for one signal: the human pilot. And somewhere in the darkness of space, a small escape pod drifted silently among the debris. The legend of the human fighter. The explosion that came from the Terran fighter spread across the battlefield like a newborn star. For a moment, the darkness of space turned white with light as the overloaded reactor released its final burst of energy. The shockwave expanded rapidly through the center of the Dominion fleet, tearing apart ships that had been positioned too close together. Several Dominion cruisers shattered instantly, their hulls splitting open as fire and debris poured into space. Smaller warships spun helplessly as the blast wave pushed them out of formation. The carefully organized Dominion armada that had once surrounded the Zareth fleet was now broken into scattered pieces drifting through the wreckage. On the bridge of the Zareth flagship, every officer stood frozen as the tactical display struggled to update after the sudden explosion. What had been a perfectly organized enemy formation only seconds earlier now appeared as a chaotic cloud of damaged ships and floating debris. The Dominion fleet had been struck directly in its center, and the result had been devastating. Their command structure had been shattered, their ships thrown out of formation, and their pursuit of the Zareth fleet had completely collapsed. Yet despite the destruction that had saved them, no one on the bridge celebrated. Queen Lyara stood beside the main display, her eyes fixed on the center of the explosion where the Terran fighter had once been. The human pilot had pushed his ship far beyond its limits to create that blast. The overloaded reactor had torn through dozens of enemy ships, but the Queen knew exactly what that meant for the pilot who had been inside the fighter moments earlier. One of the Zareth sensor officers leaned closer to his console, scanning the battlefield carefully. His hands moved quickly across the controls as the long-range scanners searched through the debris field. The silence on the bridge felt heavy as everyone waited for the results. Finally, the officer spoke. "We are detecting multiple Dominion ships destroyed, many others disabled. Their fleet is completely disorganized." The report confirmed what everyone could already see. The Dominion fleet had been broken apart by the explosion, and the remaining ships were struggling to regroup. But the Queen asked only one question. "The human pilot." The officer paused as he checked the sensors again. Several long seconds passed while the scanners searched through the wreckage drifting across the battlefield. Then suddenly his eyes widened. "I have something." Every officer on the bridge turned toward him. A small life signal, approximately 3 kilometers from the center of the explosion. The officer adjusted the scan and zoomed in on the signal. It appears to be an escape pod. A quiet wave of relief moved across the bridge. The human pilot had managed to eject before the reactor overload destroyed his fighter. Even after risking everything to break the Dominion fleet, he had still found a way to survive. Queen Lyara spoke immediately. "Dispatch a rescue craft! Bring him aboard!" Within seconds, a small Zareth recovery ship launched from the flagship and raced toward the drifting escape pod. The battlefield was still filled with Dominion wreckage and damaged ships, but the enemy fleet was now too disorganized to stop the rescue operation. Most of their surviving vessels were already retreating from the explosion zone, while others attempted to regroup under new command. As the rescue craft approached the escape pod, the pilot of the recovery ship reported the situation back to the flagship. "We have visual contact with the pod. Hull integrity stable. Life signs confirmed." The bridge crew listened closely as the recovery team carefully pulled the escape pod into their ship's cargo bay. A few moments later, the channel reopened. "The pod is secure. We are opening it now." Inside the recovery ship, the crew carefully released the locking clamps that sealed the small Terran escape pod. The hatch opened slowly with a soft mechanical sound. Inside the cramped compartment sat Captain Daniel Hayes, still strapped into the emergency seat. And his flight suit showed signs of damage from the violent ejection, and several warning lights on the pod indicated that the systems had been pushed to their limits. But he was alive. The recovery team quickly helped him out of the seat and began checking his condition. "Minor injuries," one of the medics reported over the channel. "He will survive." Back on the Zareth flagship, Queen Lyara allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. A short time later, the recovery ship returned to the flagship, carrying the human pilot who had changed the fate of the entire battle. Hayes was brought into the medical bay, where Zareth physicians immediately began treating the injuries he had received during the explosion and escape. When he finally opened his eyes again, the first thing he saw was the quiet white lighting of the alien medical room above him. For a moment, he simply stared at the ceiling while his mind slowly caught up with reality. Then he noticed someone standing beside the bed. Queen Lyara. She was no longer wearing her battle armor. Instead, she stood calmly beside him, watching the human pilot with quiet respect. Hayes blinked slowly and tried to sit up before realizing several medical devices were still attached to him. "Well," he muttered softly, "I guess that worked." The Queen tilted her head slightly. You destroyed a large portion of the Dominion fleet with a single fighter," she said calmly. "Yes, I would say it worked." Hayes let out a tired breath and leaned back against the bed. "Did your fleet make it out?" The Queen nodded. "Because of your actions, my people survived." For a moment, the room became quiet. Hayes looked at the floor as if the entire situation still felt strange to him. "I just didn't want them catching you," he said simply. The Queen studied him carefully before speaking again. "In my empire, great warriors are honored for their courage. Statues are built. Their names are remembered for generations." Hayes raised an eyebrow slightly. "You're not building a statue of me, are you?" The Queen gave a rare, faint smile. "No," she replied. "Something better." Over the following months, news of the battle spread across the galaxy, and the story of the lone human pilot who had faced an entire Dominion fleet quickly became known among dozens of star systems. Military commanders studied the battle reports with disbelief. Historians recorded the event as one of the most unexpected turning points in the war. For many alien civilizations, it was the first time they had truly understood humanity. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest. They did not possess the largest fleets. Nay, but they had something that many other species lacked. When the moment came, when everything seemed lost and defeat looked certain, a human would still stand up and fight, even if they had to do it alone. And somewhere in the galaxy, whenever soldiers spoke about the courage of humanity, one name was always remembered: Captain Daniel Hayes, the human fighter who refused to let an alien queen fall.